Alright, y'all, we got a 300 Fourtrax here. We're putting a 60% in. I'm going to show y'all everything you got to do basically to put this reduction in here. I've already had this cover off, but there's going to be 12, depending on what year it is. The newer ones, I think the last couple of years they had an extra bolt over here on this cover. But you're going to have 12, or there's 12, or if it's got that extra bolt, 13 bolts around here holding the cover on. Got to take the foot peg off. It's 4 bolts. 4 bolts that holds that on. Take it off. Take your kickstart off. She's got a 12 millimeter bolt holding it on. Get the kickstart off. Set that down. You're gonna have your little reverse arm right here. It's bolted to this little shaft that goes through the cover. It's got a 10 millimeter head bolt on it. You gotta take it loose. Then take your 3 bullet connectors loose from these terminals in here. It's your reverse, your neutral, and your oil tint light. Take all those loose, get them out of the way. Take your 12, 13 bolts around the cover, and then you got your oil line bolt here. It's got to come loose. Kind of just bend. I just bend those up out of the way. So this reverse shaft, normally that reverse shaft, it's going to try to pull out with the cover, and then your kicker shaft's going to try to pull out with the cover. It's easier to get the reverse shaft back in place, so it kind of takes 3 hands to do it, really, to do it right. But if you kind of push on that kicker shaft, push on it while you're pulling on the cover so that it stays in place inside the case, you'll be better off. You'll kind of see how it comes apart, because you're still going to have to take it out, but once you get the cover off, you can tell how it's designed, how it works in there to be able to get it off and put it back in. Because that's pretty much the trickiest part about this, is getting that kicker back in right. So I'm going to just kind of push on that with my thumb and pull on this cover. You may have to take a mallet or something and tap on it. I've already had the cover off. You may have to take a mallet or something and kind of tap around it to get it to break loose. You may have to pry on it a little bit. Just be careful. Main thing is make sure you get all your bolts out around the outside. So I'm going to push on this shaft and I'm going to kind of work this cover off. Just kind of take your time with it. Heard that reverse shaft come loose in there. See how I'm keeping pressure on that kicker shaft to keep it in place. Alright, so there's that reverse shaft I was talking about. That's how it came out in the cover. It goes down in here in this hole. Like I said, it's pretty easy, fairly simple to get it back where it's supposed to go, because you can't put it back together with this in the cover. It's got to be back in the case like it's supposed to be, or the spring will get sandwiched between the... I actually took one apart before, and somebody had it apart, didn't know what they were doing. They had that spring, they had it bolted together with that spring hanging out between the cover and the case. So I'm gonna pull that out. This bearing, your crank bearing here, that's backwards, just so you know. It's got a seal on one side, the other side's open. The seal side should face toward the inside, because the way this thing works, oil pumps through this cover. And you want that oil to be sitting in there kind of lubricating that bearing, because the oil don't sit this high in the engine. So a lot of people aren't aware of that, but that bearing's actually in there backwards. So I'm going to take a blind pull and I pull it out and flip it around. But you want to be able to see the seal. That's the right way it's supposed to be put in there. Somebody's had this one apart. Sometimes when you pull this cover off, that bearing will stay stuck on the end of the crankshaft, and somebody's had it apart and put it back in there the wrong way. I'm gonna get these clutches out of the way before I put this reverse shaft back in so y'all can see better. Alright, the next thing you want to do, you're gonna take this little arm off. Sometimes it'll come off in the cover too. But actually we'll take this off first. This little swivel part. This ball bearing piece, somebody's kind of got it mashed onto this piece here. It's normally supposed to have a spring on it, and you'll see if you take yours apart, but this one's kind of goofed up. But it's supposed to have a little spring in between here, and it's tricky putting it back on. The best thing to do is you put grease on here to kind of hold it, because when that spring is in there, it kind of wants to try to push this ball bearing. This is a separate piece here. I can get it to pop off like that. There's supposed to be a spring on here, and this one's gotten lost or something. You can see this kind of thing's bent up, and it's supposed to be like that. Spring's just there to kind of keep tension on it, to keep it from rattling around. It doesn't have to be in there. But yeah, when you're putting this thing back together, you want to smear you some grease on here so it holds this triangle shaped piece onto this swivel part to keep it from falling down while you're trying to put the cover back on. You take this, if it's a newer machine, this center piece in this plate will come out. They've got an extra piece. Some of the older ones don't have that. The bearing just sits in this plate. This is a newer one, so it's got that separate piece in there. Makes it easier for getting a socket onto this nut, because if it's the older style, you actually had to take this plate off, these your spring bolts here. You actually had to take that plate off first to be able to get a socket onto that nut. So it's kind of more aggravating. Pull this little, there's a shim. So you got a little shim here on this shaft. There's supposed to be a shim on the kicker shaft right here, because you see you just got a spline. So, and that bumps up against this face on the cover here. So there's supposed to be a shim there that kind of keeps that splined area from being able to bump up against that aluminum cover, because it will try to eat into that. But this one, like I said, somebody's already been in here and it's missing. Pull this out. That spline, it can go on different ways, but the easiest way to explain is on these motors like this with this, I call it an automatic clutch, auto clutch. Clutching mechanism is built into the shifting. So this arm pivots when you shift it. When you move the foot shifter up and down, this thing pivots one way or the other. You always want this to be lined up in the center of the basket. That's the right way that's supposed to be in there, because you can see it can go on different ways. That spline shaft is not keyed, but you want it. You see how far off it is? That's one spline off. That's centered up. That's one spline off. So it's kind of obvious if you've got it on there wrong. You want that to be lined up down the center of that basket. You get it off one way or the other, the machine's going to want to shift one way, and what it can do is that saddle piece can get out of place and fall down on the other side of this thing, and then you'll have all kinds of problems. It just won't work right. 27mm nut on these 300s. The crank nut's a left-hand thread, so it's reverse normal. Where you normally would spin it counterclockwise to loosen it, you got to spin this one clockwise to loosen it. The basket nut is a normal right-hand thread, 27mm. So I'm turning clockwise. These nuts, I had already broke these nuts loose. We got this thing apart originally, and then I found out it needed clutch weights and it needed a drum in it, so we had to wait on those parts to come in. The basket's a normal thread, right hand thread. The nuts are different. You can't really mix them up. take your magnet. This is the easiest way to get these washers to get stuck on there. Now you're ready to pull that clutch, centrifugal clutch off. Take your puller, 35mm female. We sell these on the website. Pretty much, some of these older 300s, they don't have as tight a fit on the crank as the newer machines like the 420s and the 500s. So you on these 300s, you may can get away without having to have this puller. You might, sometimes you can take a mallet, you got a little bit of room here, you can take your mallet or something and kind of knock against the drum and they'll come off pretty easy. But if it acts like it's tight, you don't want to beat on it, you'll mess stuff up. Better off just getting a puller. Just like that. You notice how when I screwed that puller on there, I didn't screw it on there tight. I backed it off just a little bit. That'll keep it from getting kind of seized up and stuck on there. And it'll come back off easier. Yeah, this thing's got, these clutches were burned up in here. Wore out. They're gone. And the drum is grooved. It's hard to tell by looking at it. But these grooves are real deep. You can feel them real good with your finger. If you can feel them grooves with your finger, you need to replace that drum. Works kind of like a brake rotor. You know, if you get a grooved brake rotor, your brakes ain't gonna grab good. That's basically how this works. Something similar to brakes. Pads and a rotor on a brake setup. That one-way bearing inside there, you see it says outside, meaning outside toward the outside cover. If that, for whatever reason, if you take this assembly apart, you just make that bearing's got to go in a certain way. You want the outside to face it where you can read it. This little shield right here, a lot of people probably don't know what that is. That's supposed to hold oil. Oil gets down there and sits between that and the drum to keep that clutch kind of cooled off. That's like a cooler. That's what that's there for. It's supposed to rub against the back of that drum and hold oil right in there. Alright, these are 2 10s. You gotta take those off. Oil pump's gonna have to come off behind this to get your drive gear off. It won't come off past the oil pump. That left side, the left bolt's longer than the right one. At this point, you might as well go ahead and pull that basket out of the way, because you got to get it out of the way to get to one of these oil pump bolts. So that should just kind of slide off pretty easy. The washer's in there. We're going to swap these out into that reduction basket after we make sure we get our bolt clear. This bolt, on pretty much all these reductions for these 300s, except maybe like the 8, I think even the 18 rubs here a little bit. That gear on the back of that basket is going to rub in this area right here, and it's also going to hit this cut. This is your gear indicator cut. Most people just delete that. That's the, some people try to grind it. I think you can, on some of the smaller sizes, get away with grinding it some. But the best thing to do is just basically delete it. Just take it out. We'll be doing all that, so you'll see what's got to be done there. Now these oil lines, you got to take this bolt loose here. And I think that actually helped. That holds the pump to the case too, if I'm not mistaken. So you gotta take that one out. You can take this whole thing loose, take this bolt out over here, and then that small bolt and this oil line, this whole oil line will come off. But honestly, what I normally do is just kind of bend it. You can bend that thing out of the way if you're careful with it. About soon.
Yep.
There's another bolt under here. Holding the oil pump. I think this one I told you wrong. I don't think it actually goes through the case. I think this is just holding the line to the pump. Because I can see back there behind the pump. Got these three here. It's actually holding the oil pump, bolting it to the case. That was tight. Jeez. Jack leg's been in this thing, in case you were wondering. Get you some kind of container, keep your bolts separated, and it's easier to. Yeah! Damn, that was way too tight.
There you go.
I tell y'all, Jack legs have been working on this thing. That bolt's shorter than these other two, but it's a good bit of difference, so you can't really mix them up. There's an oil screen that goes in here. I had already pulled it out. You need to clean all that out, check it. That it's like catches debris, keeps the debris out of the oil pump. Pull that out, clean all that out real good. Spray brake cleaner in there. A lot of times there'll be a bunch of stuff sitting on this thing or up under it. Alright, now your oil pump's ready to come off. And honestly, you don't really have to take it all the way off. You can just get it out of the way enough to get this gear off. That's really all you want, really all you're after there. Your washer behind your small gear, you're going to leave it out with our reductions, except for the 75. 75 cut comes with a, it'll come with a washer that I've cut down. With the 20, 40, and 60, you don't run that washer. Leave it out. There's an O-ring behind this oil pump, right in here. Make sure it stays there, make sure it's good and that isn't cut or anything. That's what seals up your oil pump. And that thing, when that thing is sitting on here, this gear is kind of down behind that oil pump right there. That's why you have to take the oil pump off to get the drive gear off the shaft, because it's kind of down behind it like that. Kind of a trick to this thing. But when you go to put it back in, this is what you'll have to do. If you'll grab your kicker shaft, it'll be a lot easier. You can get some leverage on this thing. Just kind of slide it on your spine a little bit. You want to be able to see how this thing works. When you kick this thing, that tab rides down this angle on this is called a kick stopper plate. And when it does that, it lets this gear, it engages back here into this gear, which is meshing with a transmission gear behind it there. That's how that thing works. So we need to get this out of the way. Because this plate's got to come off. We have to cut some of this plate, this corner. You got to grind that off, and we got to cut some of this bolt, some of that bolt head. So if you grab, you kind of get it where you can get a hold of it like that. and there's a hook, there's a spring that hooks onto this little part of the case here. Just grab that thing and there's a shim back here on the back of this shaft that just fell down. Don't know if you saw it. So you got to kind of be careful that, see how this thing's trying to unwind. It's loaded. The shim. Most time you can, if you're real careful, it'll stay on there, but sometimes it wants to fall down. Most time it'll fall down and just sit right in there, but I have had them before. They'll fall down in this window in the transmission back here. And you can fish it out. You can get you a magnet. You can go through this hole right here and get it, but you have to kind of get you some pliers, some needle nose pliers, and bend the shim a little bit to get it to come through this hole. It won't come right through there, but you can get it out. So don't panic. I'm going to get some brake cleaner. I'm going to go ahead and spray this bolt off and mark it. Mark it with a Sharpie marker so I know where to grind it at. And take that off and go ahead and take this cup off. Take some brake cleaner, just spray that bolt. Basically just get that oil off of that bolt so your marker will stick to it. You basically want to mark that head so that you know where to grind that bolt at. I'm gonna go ahead and spray this thing out a little bit. We always, clean your case out as good as you can with some brake cleaner. Get all that black, sludgy stuff out of there. Clean it out real good. Dry that bolt off. See how clean it is now? So now I can mark it. My marker will stick. I'm going to stick this on here. This is the reduction basket. This is a 60 with the bigger gear on it. I'm going to stick this on here and you're going to see. I don't know if you can tell. It's hard to tell from that angle, but I'll move the camera here a little bit. You can see where that gear is going to catch the head of that bolt. So this basket's got to go on back another probably 3/8 to 1/2 of an inch. But I think we're hitting down here on our gear indicator cup also. I think that's what it's actually hitting now. But that bolt, you can see it's going to catch on that bolt, so we got to grind the head of that bolt soon. So I put that on there and I can kind of tell. So I need to grind the bolt. I'm going to mark it like this. That tells me where I need to grind the bolt at, where the basket gear is going to be hitting it. Basically, I'm going to grind that bolt flat about, I don't know, a quarter way into the bolt head there. At that angle. That's a 5. See if I can get that. That Allen bolt has got a factory Loctite. It's Loctite from the factory. So when you get it broke loose, it's still going to be kind of tight the whole way out. You're going to see this is going to spin. This is bolted to the shift drum. The shift drum is behind here. It's going to spin into the reverse location. And I got to find a better Allen bit. And I'm going to go ahead and take this bolt out. Take this bolt out and I'm going to grind it. And I'm going to grind this side of this plate. And I'll show you guys when we come back how I've ground it. You'll see what I'm talking about. And I'm going to get this cup off of here. Alright guys, I got that top kicker, that kick stopper plate bolt here, where we marked it. Basically I ground You kind of still see some of the mark. I just pretty much ground a flat on that bolt up to about before I started hitting on the thread there on the shank of the bolt. Just put a flat on there. And so when I tighten it back up, it should be indexed right, because we kind of got it lined up with that mark, the black mark there. The gear barely rubs. So on our reductions, when I designed them, I got that gear to sit as close to the basket as I could get it. It pretty much sits right on top of the basket. Where like your stock gear, you got a little bit of space, you got a gap in between there, in between the basket and the gear. So our gear sits right and about touches the basket for, you know, clearance reasons. And this is part of it here, because on this, see, normally on these plates, the old, like on the old style reductions, your welder reductions and stuff, you really got to cut, you've got to cut this whole, basically take like a cutoff wheel and cut down the edge of that hole right there and cut that whole section out, is what you have to end up doing with that. But on ours, you just got to grind. I've just kind of grinded a flat, just a little bit of an angle right there. How good you can tell. Just more or less grinded that face down some right in that area, and it'll clear. Stick these bolts, we're going to stick this back on here and make sure it clears, the basket gear clears it. I'm going to just snug that bolt up right there, that top one. Snug it with my gun. I'm going to kind of tighten it by hand so I can kind of feel it. Because, you know, you've made this bolt head weaker, so you can't get crazy with it now when you tighten it up. If you try to use a gun, it may try to round it off. So, better be safe than sorry. You can see our bolts. Got to swing around a little bit more there before that flat's lined up like it needs to be. But when we tighten it here, I'm just doing a real, I don't know, that's probably 10, 12 foot-pounds or so there. But you see our angle is pretty much right, because we marked it where it was at before. Beautiful. I don't know if you can see that. You can see where that, it's hard to tell because of that sharpie mark is still on there. I wasn't really marking where I wanted to grind to. I was more or less marking my indexing of where I wanted, how I wanted my flat to land on that bolt there. So that clears. When you put this in here, if you just want to kind of, when you put that, slide that basket on, just kind of push on it in that area so that you know that, because this basket does have a little bit of, it will have a little bit of wobble to it. So you just more or less want to kind of push on it when you're swinging it around that bolt area and make sure you don't hear nothing rubbing. I think we're going to have to grind that plate just a smidge. I can feel it barely rubbing. You can kind of hear it probably. It's barely rubbing right there in that one spot. So I'm going to touch that a little bit more, but it's pretty good like it is. I call it a gear indicator cup. I don't know off the top of my head what Honda calls it, but so that came off. The Allen bolt was through this cut, threaded into that shift drum back there. So when you take this off, you're going to delete this. This is what I was talking about deleting. You're just going to do away with it. But what you got to do is, you can't just put the bolt back in there. There's two little pins here, and they're acting like keys. And they're keying this tab to the shift drum in there. And there's little shoulders on these pins, and that cut has a smaller hole in it, so that it catches on that shoulder of that pin to keep those pins from falling out. So when you take the cup out, you can't just put the bolt back in there, because the pins can work their way out. So what I do is I take a flat, it's a 1/4 inch. If you can find an 8mm, a true 8mm washer, it's got a smaller OD, and they work perfect. It'll fit right in between those pins, and it'll catch the shoulders of those pins and hold them in there. But if you can't find an 8mm, you can get a this is just like a regular 1/4 inch washer, and I've ground a flat because it's a little bit too wide. So if you grind a flat on one side like that, it'll fit down in between those pins and lay flat and catch those pins. So I don't know if you can see it, but see my flat landed, it caught down in there because it's a little bit too wide to fit in between the pins like it is. Alright, that's tight. And see that washer's laying flat in there. You see that flat on my washer, how it caught that pin and laid down in between the pins like that. And see the other edge is catching that shoulder on that pin. Now them pins cannot fall out. That's the right way to do it. Alright. Grind that some more. You don't want that thing rubbing there, so double check like I'm doing here. Pushing on it in that area, you know, just to make sure that it's not going to rub. Alright, we'll get on that. Get on our clearance. That's all the clearancing you got to do. Is that. Delete that cut. We're start on. We can kind of we're gonna start putting it back together now. We already cleaned the gasket off. If you take yours apart and it's got that original green Honda gasket on there, good look. Cause they're them original gaskets get stuck on there good. It's gonna take you some time to get that off. Got this. When you're loosening this bolt or tightening it, it'll spin that shift drum around. But it's not going to hurt anything. But you just want to make sure you got it back in neutral. It needs to be in neutral when you go to put everything back together. So reverse. So if you go all the way clockwise as far as you can go, where that tab is pointing down like that, that's reverse. When I put that shaft in there, I'll show you. It's basically that shaft, that little arm on that shaft, that's your reverse lockout. So it's not in there right now, so it's letting it go all the way to reverse. I'll show you how that works here shortly. So that's reverse. So go back counterclockwise one right there. That's neutral. That's your neutral location. You don't really want to put nothing in there dry. where you've been spraying it with brake cleaner, you kind of dried everything out. Make sure your O-ring's in place for your oil pump. Oil pump, that screen, so your oil pump is sucking oil. There's a hole in here, up under here. And that screen, basically it's supposed to trap like debris down here in the bottom. And it's supposed to not be able to go through that. That screen keeps debris from going up through this hole and getting into the oil pump. So if you don't have a screen, you need to make sure you get you a screen and put your screen in there and clean all that out when you take this thing apart. I went ahead and changed these clutches, plates, put new plates in here, fibers. Most time, 9 times out of 10, your steels are fine to reuse. If they're not, as long as they're not purple or discolored looking, that means they haven't been hot. And they'll be fine to reuse them. The fibers though, they'll kind of get glazed over and hard and won't grab, makes them slick. You know, they kind of just get like that with age. The main thing with this is, when you take these apart and put them back together, you want them plates to see how they're not loose, they're tight on each other in there. I'll get you a little thin shim that lays in here in between the basket. That keeps this the back side of that outer pressure plate from rubbing on the aluminum basket, the aluminum part of the basket inside there. You take this clutch pack apart to change your springs out, put new plates in here, whatever. When you put it back together, when you start to tighten these springs up, you get them started, just make sure these plates don't have any play in them. That's the main thing. Just make sure they're tight. If this moves around when you're tightening or loosening that bolt, reverse is like all the way, your reverse location is all the way counterclockwise. So just turn it one notch counterclockwise is your neutral location. Reverse is all the way clockwise. That tab will be back, more or less pointing straight down. So I'm not going to say it has to be in neutral to put it back together, but it's just a good idea to have it in neutral. I'm ready to start putting this thing back together now. I've oiled the inside of this gear, no washer on this one, on the 60. 2040 or the 60, they don't run the washer back there. Now we need to put the oil pump on. You got dowels, alignment dowels on your oil pump. Make sure they're in place. There's one here and one here. Make sure your O-ring's in place. That shorter, this is your 3 oil pump bolts. The shorter one goes on this hole to the very left here. The other 2 are the same length of each other. Alright. Make sure there shouldn't anything hit with that, but just it's a good idea just to make sure. That's your small gears. You should actually be able to slide the way ours is made. You can slide your primary on and off with the oil pump in place on the 60. Clears the top of the oil pump. Now, we'll go ahead and get this bolt back in place in this line, and we'll stick the basket on. And that bolt's normally a black color bolt. Somebody's, it's like the original bolts missing from out of this motor. But this bolt isn't black. This is a different bolt here, but that's what was in it. So kind of, if you bend this, just kind of get it back like it was in place there. Make sure your top, that fitting is in place where it fits into this hole in the case back here, like that. Alright, that's tight. That's in place. Now we're ready for the clutch basket. The screen has got, it's not a square. It's hard, it might be hard to tell on here, but it's got a taper to it. This is wider, this side here is wider than this side, so it fits in there like a wedge into the case in there, like that. Clutch basket, make sure your bushing's on there. It normally stays on there because the oil gets it stuck to the we are going to have to slide that back off. I didn't really need to put that back on, I don't reckon, just yet. And this right here can kind of be tricky sometimes. If you can hold that shaft still, you may want to put it in gear, so that shaft, and put it in 5th gear, and that shaft won't spin, because it's tricky sometimes to get these splines to line back up. You got to kind of just pull it off and rotate it. There it goes. Okay. Yeah, this gear on the 60, that gear won't clear the shoulder there on that drive gear. So you had to put the basket on first and then put your drive gear on, which the drive gear will clear the pump, so that ain't no big deal. Alright, we'll go ahead and put our nut back on our clutch basket. Tighten it up. And there should be a washer behind that nut, and that washer's got an outside. It says outside on that washer. That's like a, it acts like a lock washer. It's got a, it's kind of like a cone, what they call a cone washer, spring washer. And it says outside on there. I don't know if you can read it. But that faces outside, faces towards you. If you're going by the book, Honda says to replace those nuts because they have to be staked, but most time you can reuse them. This ain't got to be crazy tight because you're gonna stake it, so it can't really come loose. So that little, there's like a kind of like a keyway cut into that shaft. That's where you need to stake that that little lip in. That locks the nut, keeps it from being able to back off. Let's take a punch, some kind of punch. Just like that. Basically, these 300 motors spin backwards from normal. So when the way this thing works is, if you want to check that bearing, because I have heard people say sometimes they've bought aftermarket one ways that were backwards or they were marked wrong or something. So if you want to be able to make sure that it's on there right, that you got it on there right, this motor is spinning counterclockwise. So that means when it's idling, these shoes aren't grabbing the drum. They're not throwed out grabbing that drum. So when it's idling, that drum should be able to sit still, and you should be able to rotate that clutch assembly counterclockwise like that, and it should lock clockwise. That's how you need to check. That'll tell you if the one-way bearing's in the right way or not. So it's locking this way, and it's freewheeling counterclockwise. So that's right. We got to put our shield back on here though. Like I said, what that does is it catches oil behind it to help cool off that centrifugal clutch. Kind of like an oil bath, I guess. Alright. Now you're ready for your centrifugal. I'm curious how this is going to fit on here too, being it's a new, the splines are new on this backing plate assembly here. Alright, come on now. There we go. You always want to make sure, especially when you're messing with a reduction, that centrifugal assembly should spin one way like the other, and make sure you got just a little bit of in and out play on that drum. I know you can't see it in and out, but you can maybe hear it. But I got maybe like a 30-second of in and out play on there, and you got to have that because you don't want this. That means that drive assembly can float. See how it's spinning? It's hard to tell that drum is spinning, but you know it's spinning because it's turning, that gear's turning the basket. But you got to make sure that thing will spin on the crank with the crank sitting still. Because for some reason this is in a bind, you don't have that in and out play. Sometimes people will leave the washer behind the small gear back there. That's the number one reason. They don't know they got to leave that washer out. Well, it'll put that in a bind because it's made the drive too long. So what's going to happen is you're not going to have your freewheel at idle like it's supposed to have. When you go to put it in gear, it's going to try to take off, or it's going to choke the machine off because it's loading it at idle because the play feels about right. Go back on some more. Okay. You see that play we got there? That's what you want. You heard it. Maybe you can tell, but you can probably hear how that thing changed sounds when it was bottomed out. You got to make sure this is bottomed out on the crank, up against that shoulder like it's supposed to be, and then make sure you got some play here. Make sure it spins like that, you're good to go. Because if that ain't right, if it doesn't freewheel like it's supposed to, you're gonna have to go back in it. These clutch plates, if they're not tight like they're supposed to be, you're gonna have to go back in it. Left hand thread, reverse. I'm gonna just try to rotate this so I can stake that. That's it. Bearing. I was going to show y'all how to put that reverse back in there before I put all this back in there, but it's too late now. That reverse shaft, lockout shaft. Maybe you can see what I'm doing here. Anyway, so this thing goes in the case like that. That spring catches. There's a little indentation in this arm, the short side of the arm. That hook end of the spring catches in that. That's where that rests at. This is going to rest against the case up above where this case has this hump in it up above the screen. That's how that needs to get back in there. And what you'll have to do is take it like a flathead screwdriver or something. I use a flathead. And you kind of have to pop that spring back on top of that hook. So kind of get it started in there like that. Get it started in that hole. And then take you something flathead and grab this thing. Like that. Yeah, I took one of these things apart one time. Somebody been, they were doing the spring, this long arm of the spring was hanging down. It was sandwiched in between the cover and the case. And they had just tightened the cover. It was leaking oil right there. I mean, didn't have no choice but to. But they had basically mashed it in between there. So how that thing works is when you pull your reverse lever up there, your cable pulls this shaft clockwise. That pulls that arm, lets that arm come down. That's what lets it go to reverse. I don't know if you can see in there. See how it's locked up against that tab. See, it can't go to reverse right now. It's in neutral right there. So that's got that took care of. Next tricky part, I guess I'm going to show you is the kicker. I'm going to say this is probably the trickiest thing about a 300. The easiest way to do it that I found is to take that kicker shaft, kind of start it on that spline so you can grab a hold of this thing, because you've got to twist it. Kind of hard to explain it, but you want to get this hooked, that hook end of the spring there. You've got to get it, go ahead and get it in place on that where it hooks in the case in here. And you'll kind of have to get this end of your shaft started in the hole, but you'll kind of be at an angle. And you'll see what I'm talking about when I start doing it here. But you basically have to twist this shaft clockwise as you're trying to get the shaft in place, because that tab has to go. You're having to go past the plate here, down into its little home where it sits here, where it rests. see if I can, maybe I can get this shaft out of the way enough to where you can see what I'm doing here. And make sure you got your shim. Don't forget there's a shim that goes back there. So I'm gonna get that hook up there on where it's supposed to go. I'm gonna get back the tail end of my shaft back there started in its hole. So now I've got to rotate this thing. When you get to a certain point here, I'm gonna have to move my shaft around. So I'm started in the hole, I've got my hook in place, but you see my tab is way over here. It's supposed to be over here. So we got to rotate that thing and then go in with it. Here, put one of these together, mess with it, and it clicks. When you crank the engine, it's clicking, click. What it is where this thing is ratcheting, and it's not put in there right, and it's ratcheting, hitting, the faces are sitting there steadily hitting each other where it's trying to engage. So I'm going to take it, I'm going to rotate this thing when I get it far enough in there where I can. Pull this I'm going to have to pull this kicker shaft out. There we go. Now, something is holding me up here. What I got? I think I went too far back. Alright, here you go. You kind of got to have it. It's hard to explain. It's got to be started in the hole, but it can't be all the way, it can't be too far back in the hole. It's just barely got to be started in that hole back there. You actually may not be able to start it in the hole. So this one seems like the gears are trying to catch. Trying to get to where you can see what I'm doing. But I'm rotating this thing. Yeah. You can't really get it in the hole just yet until you get that tab in place. See how I'm rotating this thing around to get that tab back under here where it's supposed to be, and then I'm going to go into that hole with the shaft. Like that right there. That's right. That's how you do it. And like I said, that's the easiest way for me to do it, is to put that on. That gives you a lot of leverage to be able to twist that shaft because you're fighting that spring back there. I hadn't done one of these in a while. You see them teeth back in there engaged. They're not supposed to be engaged until you push down on that kicker. These teeth back in here that I'm talking about, I'm not talking about the gear teeth, I'm talking about these teeth that engages this outer part to that gear. Might be hard for you to tell, but the thing engages when you rotate that shaft. Engages that gear right there. Do your little pivot arm here. Make sure it's centered up with the basket. That arm, imagine drawing a center line up that arm, you want it to land through the center of the basket. Got your shim on here. Normally this triangle piece won't stay in place like that. Somebody's played with it before and they've got it where it kind of stays on there, but the spring is missing. Normally Normally what you had to do, like I said, you had to take, this won't stay on, it'll try to fall off. You had to take and smear you some grease on here in between them two pieces to get it to stick on there and stay in place. Because a lot of times what will happen is it'll stay like that, but when you go to start putting that cover on and moving stuff around and shaking, this thing, you'll hear it fall down in the cover, then you got to pull the cover back off. Now I got that bearing pulled out of that clutch cover I was talking about. It was in there backwards. So you got an open side and you got a sealed or a shielded side. I don't remember seeing any of these. Normally these have an orange rubber seal. This is a metal shielded bearing, so I don't know if that's been replaced or what. That would explain why it was in there backwards though. Somebody might have replaced that. I don't think that's a Honda. It may be though, I don't know. The only ones I ever remember seeing them had an orange seal, rubber seal. Alright, I got that back in there. I've already cleaned this cover and stuff. So that's how it's supposed to be in there. We ready for the gasket. Put a gasket on there. Pop the cover back on. We missed a couple spots on this old gasket, getting it off here. You want to make sure you get all that old gasket off. You don't want the high spots. You know, that can cause sealing problems. I'll do something. I just want to do it one time and be done with it. I don't want to have to go back. It's one thing I hate is having to do the same thing more than once. Because I was rushing or something the first time and missed something. Tell you another little secret too on these, I use an OEM gasket, Honda gasket. I think it's the last 2 years anyway, they had an extra bolt hole here. That's the only difference. So I basically just used that newer style gasket. You know where it's got that extra bolt hole here. If the case don't have that hole, it doesn't bother anything. There's just an extra hole sitting there, you know, gasket material, but that's not going to bother nothing. But if you use that gasket there, I mean, if you're doing more than one of these, if you're doing these at a shop or whatever, best thing to do is just stock that newer style gasket. That way, basically, you got a one size fits all. And if you put some oil, always take and put some motor oil around this gasket here. It'll help keep it from sticking when you take have to take the thing back apart. Keeps the gasket from sticking to the cover and the case so bad and having to scrape it to get it off. Saves you a lot of time. Save the next person that goes in this, save them some headache. Just put a little coat of oil. Just put some on your fingers and wipe it on that gasket. A little thin layer of oil. Your dowels, your alignment dowels, you got one here. They'll kind of hold that gasket in place while you get the cover on. There's the other one right here. You should be able to set that gasket on there like that. Oh, that's gonna be aggravating. There we go. like that right there. See, you don't have, see, these cases don't have that extra hole over there, but it's not gonna bother anything. Make sure you got everything like it's supposed to be. We got the oil pump screen back in place, reverse shaft, you got your shim. I think there's actually supposed to be a shim. I'm pretty sure there's supposed to be a shim on this reverse shaft too, up against, that way the snap ring is not rubbing against the cover. But I see it was missing also. Biggest thing when you're putting the cover back on is if you have to kind of pull it back to you or something, make sure you keep that, because it doesn't take much to pull this shaft out of place, that kicker shaft. And same thing, well, the reverse shaft, you got to pull it out a good ways to kind of get it messed up, but that kicker shaft, it doesn't have to slide out of place much, and you'll hear that thing come loose in there. That tab, so that tab is real close to this radius, so it's already, it won't take much for it to want to try to ride up. When it starts trying to ride up on that radius, it'll kind of kick itself out of place. Then you just have to pull the cover all the way back off and fix it. So I always kind of keep my, like when I was taking it apart, I kind of keep my thumb against that shaft to make sure it's staying where it's supposed to stay at. And I think, all these I've ever messed with, when you got to put this cover back on, if you'll kind of pick up, you kind of got to pick up on the cover to get the alignment right of the shafts and stuff inside there, because that stuff's kind of sagging, hanging out of them cases. So if you kind of pick up on the cover, it'll go together like it's supposed to, quicker or easier. You won't have to you won't have to fight it, I guess is the word. I'm just making a mess with oil. Keep my finger, so I'm keeping my thumb on that shaft against it, and you're gonna have to kind of work this thing. I'm going to kind of play with it. So I had to kind of push up on it to get it to go that little bit right there. Alright. If you're lucky, it'll go on like that. Easy. That's done. Now, I ain't gonna show you on that, but you just got, put your bolts back in around the cover, tighten them up, your oil, your line bolt, banjo bolt, get your kicker back on. I'm gonna show you how to do that little, basically when you do that, when you delete that gear indicator cup in there, so basically what that thing does is that works the neutral light and the reverse light up on your dash. So when you take that out, those lights aren't going to work, because that cup is not there to ground out your switches. That's how that works. You got two little switches in this cover, and them high spots on that cup makes your ground, makes the circuit to turn those lights on. So of course, your neutral light's got to work for the electric start to work. So what you have to do is on that neutral wire, that green wire here, this is your reverse, and it'll say on there it's got an N and an R on that piece of rubber. See your N, that's your neutral wire. What I like to do is I take a bullet connector. I make a little jumper wire with a bullet about 2 inches long, 3 inches long, and I put a bullet connector, a male, on one end of it, and the other end I put a ring terminal, and I'll ground it to this little metal cover behind this bolt right here, behind the cover. Sandwich that ring terminal in there, and that'll make your ground contact on your neutral wire for that neutral light to work, which is what you have to do on all these reductions on these 300s. for the electric start to work. So I'm gonna go ahead and get all these bolts back in place, get the kicker back on.